You don't belong here, old man. You think that flag pin on your chest makes you one of us. But to me, you're just a washed-up nobody, a man whose time has passed, sitting in a seat meant for better people, taking up space in a town that doesn't need your kind. So hear me now. Finish that cheap coffee and get out before I drag you across this floor myself. Let everyone watch you crawl like the useless relic you are. Those words, spit out like poison, came from Officer Mark Reynolds, a man sworn to protect and serve. But on that morning, inside that small-town diner, he chose humiliation over honor, cruelty over decency. And before we step into this story, I want to ask you something simple. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button so more people can hear this. Now, let's begin. It was a Tuesday morning in Asheville, North Carolina. The kind of morning that felt predictable, steady, almost safe. When life followed routines and people moved without thinking twice. Jackson's Diner stood at the corner of Main Street, a place that smelled of bacon grease and fresh coffee, a place where old men read the paper, farmers discussed weather, and waitresses smiled politely while pouring refills, for 3 years straight, at the exact same time. Henry Washington walked through its glass doors, 72 years old, a Marine Corps veteran, a man who had stood in jungles far from home, a man who had carried brothers out of firefights, and a man who had returned with scars that never fully healed. He was not tall anymore. His shoulders had curved with age. But when he entered a room, people noticed the quiet strength. On his cardigan, pinned neat and straight, were two things that told his story without words: a Purple Heart medal, proof that he had shed blood for his country, and a small American flag pin, polished daily, never tarnished, never crooked. He never bragged, never asked for attention. His life now was routine. Every Tuesday, he came for the same order: black coffee, wheat toast. Exact change counted slowly but carefully from a worn leather wallet. He always sat at the same booth in the far corner, his back to the wall, his eyes toward the door. Old habits from the Marines that never left him. He watched exits. He folded his napkin with precision. He ate slowly, deliberately, as if time itself was to be respected. To the waitress, Linda Perez. Henry was more than just a regular. She was 35, Latina, hard-working, raising a young son on her own, and she admired the way Henry carried himself. She often said to co-workers, "That man has more dignity in silence than most people do in a lifetime." And every week, when he smiled faintly at her and thanked her with a gentle nod, it reminded her why respect mattered. But across the diner, that respect was not shared. Officer Mark Reynolds sat in uniform, though his collar was open, his breath still carrying the faint scent of whiskey from the night before. At 38, he had built a reputation that most townsfolk knew but few dared to say aloud. He was aggressive, heavy-handed, quick to use his badge like a weapon. Complaints had been filed, whispers of brutality and intimidation spread, but nothing ever stuck. The sheriff looked the other way. Politicians liked his loyalty, and so Reynolds walked with the kind of arrogance that comes from believing consequences never arrive. That morning, he noticed Henry. He always noticed Henry. Something about the calmness, the quiet confidence, the lack of fear. It irritated him. As Henry laid 3/4 on the table for his coffee, Reynolds leaned back in his chair and muttered, loud enough for others to hear, "These people always think they belong, acting like this is their place. Not in my town." His companion shifted awkwardly but said nothing. A couple at another table froze their forks midway, eyes darting down to their plates. Everyone heard it. No one responded. Silence in that diner was the same as permission. Linda clenched her jaw, refilling cups at another booth, praying he would stop. Henry heard it too, but his response was the same as always: calm, steady, deliberate. He looked up, his voice low but firm. "I'm just having coffee. Officer, I'm not bothering anyone." Those words should have been enough. They were polite, respectful, the kind of reply meant to de-escalate. But to Reynolds, they felt like defiance. He shoved his chair back with a screech of metal against tile, stood tall, his boots thudding across the floor. All eyes turned as he approached Henry's table. The air thickened, the smell of coffee suddenly sharper, the silence louder. Reynolds slammed his hand on the table, rattling the cup, spilling a bit of dark liquid onto the napkin Henry had folded so neatly. That was when he leaned in and let loose the words that opened this story, the venom that set everything in motion. And in that moment, the diner changed. Forks stopped. Conversations died. Linda's hand shook as she gripped the coffee pot tighter. A young journalism student named Ethan Brooks, sitting near the window with his camera for a college project, instinctively pressed record. His assignment had been to capture authentic small-town life. But what he was about to capture would travel far beyond Asheville, far beyond North Carolina, and land on the desk of men and women in Washington. Henry sat motionless. His hands were steady. His jaw firmed but did not tremble. He had faced worse than this. Men with guns, men with hate, men who truly wanted him dead. But at 72, after all he had given, after all he had lost, he did not expect the enemy to wear a badge in his own country. He lifted his chin, looked Reynolds in the eye, and said with the calm authority of a soldier who never forgot who he was, "Officer, I have every right to be here." The words were soft, almost gentle, but they struck harder than a shout. Around him, phones began to rise, recording. Because everyone knew something was about to happen, Linda whispered under her breath, "Please, God, don't let this go where I think it's going." The diner was a powder keg, and in that instant, with the old veteran refusing to bend and the angry officer looming above him, the fuse had already been lit. The room was silent, yet the silence carried weight, a silence so heavy it felt like the walls of the diner were closing in. And all that tension pointed straight toward Henry Washington, the 72-year-old veteran sitting calmly in his corner booth, his hands folded, his back straightened, while Officer Mark Reynolds hovered over him, fueled by ego and the thrill of dominance, his voice dripping with venom as he demanded the old man stand up and leave. But Henry did not move. He simply met the officer's stare with steady eyes, eyes that had once stared down jungle ambushes in Vietnam, eyes that had seen the cost of freedom and the price of hatred, and that calmness, that unshaken resolve, infuriated Reynolds even more. His hand slammed down harder on the table, coffee sloshed, the cup tipped, dark liquid pooling across the surface, staining the napkin Henry had folded with military precision. Yet Henry did not flinch. He simply lifted the cup gently and set it upright, an action so calm, so deliberate, that it made the officer look almost childish in his rage. People around the diner froze. Linda Perez, the waitress, gripped her coffee pot so tight her knuckles whitened, her jaw trembling between fear and anger. She wanted to step in, wanted to tell Reynolds to back off, but the badge on his chest reminded her that speaking out might cost her job, maybe even her safety, and so she kept pouring coffee at another table, though her eyes never left Henry. Meanwhile, near the window, Ethan Brooks, the 22-year-old journalism student, kept his camera steady, his lens trained on the scene. He had come to the diner to capture the rhythm of small-town life for a class assignment. But now his instincts told him this was bigger, much bigger. His professor had said capture truth, and here truth was unfolding raw and unfiltered before his eyes. His hands shook, but he did not stop filming, and that one decision would soon carry this story far beyond Asheville, far beyond North Carolina, into homes across the nation. Reynolds leaned in closer, his shadow covering Henry, his lips curling as he spat the words. "Stand up, old man, or I'll make you." His voice so loud it echoed off the chrome and tile. A few customers whispered nervously. One man in a plaid shirt muttered, "Leave him alone." But the words fell quiet, drowned under the officer's authority. The badge gleaming on his chest was like a shield that silenced dissent. Henry's hand rested on the table, steady, unmoving, his voice low but clear. "Officer, I told you, I have every right to sit here." Reynolds sneered, mocking. "You think that medal makes you special? You think people care that you were some soldier decades ago? This is my town, my rules." His hand moved toward Henry's shoulder, fingers twitching with the urge to grab, to force, to show his power. And in that moment, time slowed. Every breath in the diner felt sharp, every eye glued to the confrontation. Linda whispered a prayer under her breath. Ethan zoomed his camera tighter. An elderly woman near the counter gasped softly and clutched her purse. Fire Chief Daniel Harper, sitting at a nearby booth, shifted in his seat, his instincts as a first responder screaming that this was spiraling out of control. But even he hesitated, because this was a police officer in uniform, and stepping in meant crossing a line that few in small towns dared to cross. Reynolds finally shoved Henry's shoulder, a forceful push meant to intimidate. Henry's body rocked slightly. His hip hit the edge of the booth. Pain shot through his side. But still he steadied himself, his jaw tightening, his dignity refusing to crumble. "That's enough," Henry said firmly, his voice not loud, but resonant, cutting through the silence like steel. Reynolds smirked. "Or what, old man? What are you going to do?" He laughed, a laugh that sounded more like a threat than humor. "You gonna call someone? You gonna tell the world how the big bad cop picked on you? Nobody cares. Nobody's listening." And yet, in that very moment, several phones lifted higher, recording, streaming, documenting, because people did care. They were listening. They were watching. Linda finally placed her coffee pot down on the counter, wiped her shaking hands on her apron, and pulled out her phone, pressing record, her whisper barely audible. "Not this time. Not again." Reynolds noticed the phones, his anger spiking, his face flushed red, veins rising at his temple. "Put those down," he barked, pointing at the cameras. "This is police business." But no one lowered their phones. Not Ethan, not Linda, not the group of teenagers at the counter who were already live on Instagram. The tide in the room had shifted. People were no longer silent witnesses. They were becoming participants, and Reynolds felt it, his power slipping as the room refused to back down. Yet he pressed harder, leaning close enough that Henry could smell the stale alcohol on his breath. "Last chance," he growled. "Leave, or I'll drag you through that door and make an example out of you." Henry's hands were steady, his eyes unshaken, but inside his chest, a storm brewed, not of fear, but of memory. Flashes of younger days when men in power looked at him the same way, when orders barked at him meant life or death, when survival depended on standing firm or falling, and with all the weight of his 72 years. Henry straightened fully, the old Marine posture returning, his chin high, his eyes sharp, his voice clear. "You don't scare me, officer. Not today. Not ever." And those words, simple yet strong, cracked the air like thunder. The diner shook with its truth, and for the first time, Reynolds faltered, his smirk slipping, his bravado thinning, because deep down, beneath the alcohol and the arrogance, even he recognized the strength of a man who had faced down real enemies. And suddenly his uniform looked less like authority and more like a mask. But pride would not let him step back, not in front of an audience, not with so many phones recording. So instead he clenched his fists tighter, his voice rising. "Then you're about to learn who really runs this town." And with those words, the situation, already tense, prepared to explode into something no one in that diner would ever forget. The diner seemed to hold its breath. Every person frozen, every phone camera steady, the tension coiled so tight it could snap at any second. And in that heavy silence stood Henry Washington, the 72-year-old Marine Corps veteran, calm but firm, refusing to move from his booth, while Officer Mark Reynolds loomed over him, his face red with rage, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. And then, in one sudden movement, the line was crossed. The officer's open hand shot out, and with a crack that echoed through the room like a gunshot, he slapped Henry hard across the face, the sound so sharp that coffee cups rattled on the counter, forks clattered against plates, and a woman at the corner table gasped loud enough for all to hear. Henry's head snapped to the side, his cheek burning, his lips split, and for a brief moment he looked exactly as the officer wanted him to look, like a frail old man brought low. But only for a moment, because then Henry straightened. His shoulders pulled back, his chin lifted, and the dignity in his eyes burned hotter than any pain. Blood trickled slowly down from the corner of his mouth, catching the light, and the small American flag pin on his chest glinted as if to remind everyone in the room of who he truly was. A man who had once carried a rifle for the same country whose uniform was now used to strike him. And the diner erupted. Voices shouted, "Jesus Christ! Stop! That's enough!" Linda Perez screamed. "You can't do that! He's done nothing wrong!" Her phone held high, capturing every second, her live stream audience already flooding with comments. Ethan Brooks zoomed tighter on his camera, his heart pounding but his hands steady, knowing this was the kind of moment that would define more than just a school project. This was history unfolding. Fire Chief Daniel Harper half stood from his booth, torn between his oath as a public servant and the fear of challenging a police officer in uniform. But the sight of the elderly veteran being struck broke through his hesitation. "Reynolds, that's enough," he barked, his voice shaking with anger. But Reynolds ignored him, too deep in his own intoxication of power. The slap had felt good to him. It had given him control, at least in his mind, and he wanted more. "Now apologize," Reynolds demanded, his voice booming across the diner, pointing down at Henry as if he were a criminal. "Apologize for making good people uncomfortable." Henry's jaw tightened. His hand slowly came up to touch the blood at his lip, his eyes fixed on the officer, his voice calm but cutting. "I will not apologize for existing." The words hung in the air, and the silence that followed them was louder than any shout. Reynolds's face twisted. He had expected fear, submission, maybe tears, but instead he was met with dignity, and that only enraged him further. "Wrong answer," he snarled, his hand twitching as if ready to strike again. But by now the room was no longer frozen. The bystanders were no longer just witnesses. They were participants. Phones were everywhere, recording from every angle. Linda's live stream view count was climbing by the hundreds each minute. Teenagers whispered that it was already trending. A man near the counter said quietly, "He hit a veteran. He actually hit him." Mrs. Wallace, an elderly woman who had lost her husband in Korea, clutched her chest and said, "That man served this country," her voice trembling with outrage. Fire Chief Harper stepped closer. "Reynolds, step back, right now." But Reynolds, cornered by his own pride, shouted, "Anyone interferes, they'll be arrested." He puffed his chest, the badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. But that badge, in that moment, looked less like authority and more like a weapon, and the crowd knew it. Henry steadied himself, slowly rising from his booth, his height no longer what it had been in his youth, but his presence commanding. The years fell away in his posture, the soldier in him coming alive, and he looked directly at Reynolds, his cheek red and swollen, his voice firm. You've just made the worst mistake of your life." The words were not shouted, not filled with rage. They were calm, steady, and they cut through the officer's bravado like steel. Reynolds laughed, trying to cover the crack in his armor. "What are you going to do about it? Call your mommy," he sneered. But the laugh faltered when Henry pulled his phone slowly from his pocket, the gesture calm, deliberate, and dialed a single number, the first contact on his list, his son, Michael Washington, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The phone rang once, twice. Then a voice came through, steady, authoritative, and concerned. "Dad, is everything all right?" And in that moment, the diner went completely silent, everyone realizing what they were hearing. The calm voice of one of the most powerful men in America speaking through the phone of the man who had just been humiliated. Reynolds froze, his smirk slipping, his breath catching. "Michael, I'm fine," Henry said calmly, though his cheek was still bleeding. "But there's been an incident." The officer's laughter dried up in his throat. His arrogance shriveled. The name alone was enough to turn the room upside down. People began whispering. "Did he say Michael Washington, the FBI director?" "Oh my God. That's his father." Linda's live stream comment section exploded. "That's the FBI director's dad. This cop is done. Screenshots now." Henry's voice, steady as ever, continued. "A local officer assaulted me in Jackson's diner. It's all been recorded." The line was quiet for a beat. Then Michael's voice came, sharper, colder. "Dad, are you hurt? Do you need medical?" Henry replied. "Not seriously, son, but I wanted you to hear directly before the news does." Reynolds staggered back a step, his face draining of color, his arrogance evaporating as reality struck. He had not just slapped an old man. He had assaulted the father of the FBI director, and every second of it had been caught on camera. The room buzzed, voices overlapping. The balance of power had shifted completely. And for the first time, Officer Mark Reynolds felt what it was like to lose control. The slap that was meant to humiliate Henry Washington would become the slap that humiliated him in front of the entire nation. The moment Henry Washington's phone call revealed the truth of who his son was, the entire diner seemed to tremble under the weight of realization. Whispers spread like fire. Linda Perez's live stream comments surged by the thousands. Teenagers at the counter shouted that the video was already viral, and within minutes the footage of Officer Mark Reynolds striking a 72-year-old veteran, the father of the FBI director, was racing across social media platforms at a speed no one in that diner could comprehend. People from New York to Los Angeles, from rural farms to bustling cities, were watching the same clip, hearing the same words, and gasping at the same slap. Hashtags exploded across the internet. Justice for Henry trended number 3 nationally within an hour, then number 1 by lunchtime. Alongside it came, "Respect our veterans. FBI protects its own," and a darker one that simply read, "Fire Reynolds." Linda watched her phone shake in her hands as view counts skyrocketed. 10,000, 50,000, 100,000. Ethan Brooks uploaded his clearer footage from the DSLR camera. His video titled, "Police Officer Assaults Elderly Veteran," hit 2 million views before the evening. Mainstream news outlets picked it up. Anchors on national television replayed the moment again and again, the sharp sound of the slap punctuating every broadcast. Commentators shook their heads. Retired generals called in to speak about the indignity of striking a man who had once bled for the nation. And slowly, the story shifted from one diner in Asheville to a question about justice in America. In the town itself, panic spread among leadership. Sheriff Tom Harlan called an emergency meeting, his voice tight with worry as he spoke to the mayor, Martha Johnson. "We've got to get ahead of this." But Martha was just as shaken, pacing her office, phone buzzing with reporters demanding comment, her words cracking. How do you get ahead of a story that's already on every channel in America? She asked, but Harlan pressed. We issue a statement. Say it's a misunderstanding. We buy time. So that afternoon, the sheriff stood before cameras, his uniform crisp, his face pale, reading a bland, prepared speech. We are aware of the incident at Jackson's diner. All parties are cooperating. The matter is under review. His words fell flat, meaningless against the backdrop of raw video evidence already circulating online. People laughed at his statement. Memes appeared mocking his tone. And meanwhile, the FBI itself had moved. Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, a trusted lieutenant of Director Michael Washington, assembled a rapid response team. Within hours, federal vehicles rolled into Asheville, their presence sending a shockwave through the local police department. Reporters gathered outside the diner interviewing witnesses. Linda Perez stood before cameras, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. I saw everything. I recorded everything. That man did nothing wrong. He was just drinking his coffee when the officer attacked him. Ethan Brooks, though only 22, spoke firmly. The world needs to see the truth. No edits, no spin. Just what happened. That's why I posted the full video. And both of them became instant voices for justice, their names appearing in headlines, their faces on screens. Officer Reynolds, on the other hand, was nowhere to be seen. His house surrounded by journalists, his phone off, his lawyer issuing a weak statement claiming the incident is being taken out of context. But context did not matter anymore. The slap spoke for itself, the rage on his face, the dignity on Henry's. Those images defined the story. Henry himself chose silence. He returned home with his son's security detail quietly posted outside his door, refusing most interview requests. But his image sitting calm after the blow was enough. It said more than words could. Across the country, veterans groups reacted. The American Legion issued a statement condemning the assault. VFW halls draped banners reading, "We stand with Henry." Military families posted photos with the hashtag #Justice for Henry. On talk radio, callers raged. If they can slap a veteran in uniform, in front of everyone, what chance does anyone else have? And the nation listened. In Asheville, the diner itself became a shrine of sorts. Flowers appeared outside, letters taped to the windows thanking Henry for his service. People drove from nearby towns just to take pictures at the booth where he had sat. But inside the halls of power, fear mounted. Mayor Martha Johnson feared for the tourism season. Investors called her office, threatening to pull out of development projects. Property owners worried about falling values. And whispers began that the mayor had known about Reynolds's temper long before this, that complaints had been filed but ignored. And the sheriff's credibility collapsed further when leaked emails showed he had dismissed at least 4 prior complaints against Reynolds without investigation. Federal investigators seized the sheriff's files, uncovering more missing reports, more buried evidence, and by Wednesday morning, less than 48 hours after the slap, the Department of Justice had formally announced a civil rights investigation, the Attorney General himself saying, "No individual, regardless of uniform, is above the law, and no citizen, regardless of age or race, should be subjected to such abuse." The town split in two. Some locals defended Reynolds on Facebook groups, calling him a good officer having a bad day, but their voices were drowned out by millions of others demanding accountability. Linda Perez's follower count jumped from 800 to over 100,000 in a single night. Her live streams became daily updates. Ethan's documentary footage was licensed by national outlets, and donations poured into a community fund to support Henry and others who had faced discrimination. By Friday, that fund reached $620,000, proving that people were not just outraged, they were willing to act, and yet through it all, Henry remained composed, speaking only once to a local reporter when asked what justice meant to him, his words quiet but unforgettable. "Justice is not about me. It's about making sure the next man, the next woman, the next child doesn't suffer in silence. Those words replayed on evening broadcasts across America, his calm voice contrasting with the chaos swirling around. And in Washington, D.C., Michael Washington stood before FBI staff, his message stern. This investigation will be handled with full transparency. No favoritism, no shortcuts. The badge is sacred, and when it is abused, it dishonors us all. In Asheville, Mark Reynolds sat alone, watching his name become a curse, his career collapsing in real time, his arrogance stripped, and in his silence he knew that the slap which had made him feel powerful for a second had destroyed everything he thought he controlled. By the time the weekend arrived, the slap inside Jackson's diner was no longer just a viral video. It was the spark that lit a fire under the entire justice system. And when federal investigators arrived in Asheville with their black SUVs and sealed evidence bags, the locals knew this was no longer a story they could spin away. Special Agent Sarah Mitchell led the team, a woman with 20 years of experience in civil rights cases, her voice calm, but her eyes razor-sharp. She gathered witness statements, pulled security camera footage, collected digital files, and what she uncovered shook even seasoned investigators. Because the assault on Henry Washington was not an isolated act of rage. It was the visible tip of something much darker buried beneath the surface of this small town. The first discovery came when Ethan Brooks handed over his raw footage, hours of recordings before and after the slap, background conversations, offhand comments, little moments that seemed meaningless until analyzed frame by frame. In one clip, Officer Reynolds could be seen bragging to another man weeks earlier, saying, "You gotta put folks in their place or they'll start thinking they belong everywhere." Words caught casually, but damning when played against the images of him striking a 72-year-old veteran. Then came the sheriff's files, or rather, the absence of them, because over a dozen complaint reports against Reynolds and other officers had vanished, missing from the record, wiped clean as if they never existed. But digital forensics pulled fragments from county servers, traces of deleted PDFs, ghost records that proved a pattern. African-American teenagers stopped repeatedly for loitering. Hispanic families questioned about their right to be at the community pool. Native veterans harassed at polling places, each dismissed as misunderstanding, each buried by Sheriff Tom Harlan's pen. The evidence mounted quickly, and then the financial trail appeared. Janet Collins, a bank clerk brave enough to risk her job, handed over internal memos showing discriminatory lending practices, files marked with phrases like demographic stability and undesirable shifts. Documents revealing that property loans were approved or denied not based on credit, but on race. Investigators connected the dots. Brad Morrison, a local contractor and longtime ally of Reynolds, had donated thousands to the mayor's business development fund. That same fund was tied to redevelopment projects that conveniently pushed minority-owned shops out of prime downtown locations. Federal subpoenas uncovered emails between council members where phrases like maintain traditional character and keep certain folks out of Main Street were used openly. Each email stamped with dates, times, and names that left no room for denial. The investigation spread wider. Phone records showed over 50 calls exchanged between Officer Reynolds and Mayor Johnson's office in the days leading up to the slap. Text messages revealed coordination. "We can't let these people think they own the place," one message read. "Make an example," another said. It was systematic exclusion, a strategy not just of prejudice but of profit, because every time a minority business closed, property values dipped, developers swooped in, and connected officials made money. Agent Mitchell spread the files across a table in the sheriff's office, her team staring at a map marked with red pins for every recorded incident. The pattern was undeniable. Asheville had become a modern sundown town in practice, if not in name. Henry Washington's humiliation was simply the latest chapter in a long, ugly book. When the findings leaked to the press, national outrage intensified. Commentators no longer called it a slap. They called it a conspiracy. News anchors displayed charts of the financial connections, timelines of harassment, quotes from the emails that made viewers gasp. Veterans organizations announced they would march in Asheville. The ACLU filed a civil rights lawsuit on behalf of Henry and other victims. And the Justice Department prepared indictments. Inside his home, Henry sat quietly with his son Michael, the FBI director who had flown down to stand by him. The father spoke softly. "Son, this was never about me. It was about dignity." Michael nodded, his voice firm. "And dignity is what we're going to restore, not just for you, Dad, but for everyone they tried to silence." Meanwhile, Officer Reynolds, once arrogant and untouchable, now sat under federal guard, his badge stripped, his name reviled, his lawyer overwhelmed by evidence. Every day new footage surfaced, new witnesses came forward, and Reynolds could no longer deny his role. But the most devastating blow came from inside his own circle. Fire Chief Daniel Harper, who had once hesitated in the diner, turned over 6 months of his own private notes, records of meetings where city leaders discussed keeping Asheville's identity, coded language that now rang loud as discrimination. His testimony broke the wall of silence. Mrs. Wallace, the widow who had gasped in the diner, stepped forward too, revealing that her late husband had been harassed years earlier by the same officer, and she had been too afraid to speak. Tears running down her face as she declared, "Not anymore, not after what they did to Henry." The investigation grew into a storm that swept everyone in its path. Mayor Johnson's resignation was demanded. Sheriff Harlan faced federal obstruction charges. Reynolds was suspended without pay and barred from contacting witnesses. And the FBI director himself addressed the nation from Washington, his words steady, personal, filled with quiet fury. "This is not about my father alone. This is about every American who has been told they don't belong. This is about every abuse of the badge, every silence that allowed injustice to spread. And let me be clear, silence ends now." The statement replayed across every channel. It was clipped into viral sound bites. It became a rallying cry, and ordinary people who had once whispered now spoke loudly. The hashtag #AskSilenceEndsNow trended alongside Justice for Henry. Donations to the community fund surpassed $1 million, and Asheville found itself under a microscope, its leaders crumbling, its reputation shattered. The slap that Mark Reynolds thought would make him feel powerful had instead pulled the curtain back on a machine of corruption. And as the evidence piled higher, the town realized this was not just the fall of one man. It was the unraveling of an entire system that had thrived on silence and intimidation for far too long. By the time Monday evening came, the entire town of Asheville felt like it was standing on a knife's edge. And when the community center doors opened for the emergency town hall, hundreds of people poured inside, their voices hushed, but their eyes burning with anticipation. Reporters filled the back rows, cameras lined the walls, and outside in the cool night air, an overflow crowd gathered around speakers and giant screens broadcasting every word. This was not just a local meeting anymore. This was a reckoning. Federal agents stood along the edges, their presence quiet but undeniable. And on the stage sat 3 figures who commanded all attention. Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, with the thick binder of evidence before her. U.S. Attorney Leonard Graves, who had flown down from Washington to oversee the case. And FBI Director Michael Washington, who sat not as a son tonight, but as a symbol of national accountability. At the front row sat Henry Washington, cardigan neatly pressed, flag pin shining under the lights, his cheek still bruised but his posture strong. And when the crowd noticed him, they rose as one. A standing ovation that thundered in the hall. forcing even the cameras to shake. Henry lifted his hand in modest acknowledgement, then sat quietly as the proceedings began. The first to speak was Agent Mitchell, her voice calm but unyielding as she laid out the findings. Chart after chart displayed on screens. Footage of Reynolds's slap replayed in grim silence. Email chains with racist language. Financial records linking city leaders to exclusion schemes. Maps dotted with incidents of harassment. Her words cut like a scalpel. This was not an isolated incident. This was a pattern of systemic discrimination carried out through negligence, corruption, and intimidation, the crowd murmured. Some gasped. Others shouted, "Shame!" The attorney Graves followed, his voice deeper, more formal. Based on the evidence presented, our office will pursue federal civil rights charges against Officer Mark Reynolds, Sheriff Tom Harlan, and Mayor Martha Johnson for obstruction, conspiracy, and violations under Title 18. The words fell heavy, the sound of justice moving from talk to action. At the back of the hall sat Reynolds himself with his lawyer, his once proud posture broken, his face pale, sweat beading along his temples as he realized there was no escape, his arrogance stripped, his power gone. People turned in their seats to glare at him. Whispers of disgust filled the air. Mrs. Wallace, the widow, stood up from the audience and shouted, "He slapped a veteran. My husband served too, and you dishonored them all." The applause that followed drowned out any attempt by Reynolds's lawyer to shush her. Then came the testimony phase. Linda Perez walked to the microphone, her hands trembling at first, but her voice gaining strength with each word. "I watched him strike Mr. Washington. I filmed it. I streamed it. And I will not be silent anymore. I was scared for my job, but silence only protects the guilty." The room erupted in cheers. Next, Ethan Brooks approached, the young journalism student holding his notes but barely looking at them. "I thought I was making a school project, but I filmed history. I filmed truth, and I stand by it. This community deserves better. America deserves better." His words drew another wave of applause. Then Fire Chief Harper admitted his own failure, voice breaking as he confessed. "I saw too much and said too little. I documented harassment but never filed it officially. I failed in my duty. But tonight I stand with justice." The weight of his honesty moved even Henry, who nodded quietly in approval. Then the final testimony came from Mrs. Patterson, the mayor's own wife, who stepped to the microphone, her voice steady as she revealed private conversations, recordings of her husband dismissing complaints, prioritizing property values over people. Her betrayal of him in that moment became her redemption. "Leadership is not about convenience," she said firmly. "It is about courage, and I will not protect cowardice anymore." The crowd sat stunned. The mayor herself slumped in her chair, face gray with defeat. And then the mediator, an experienced federal official named Linda Hayes, called for order. "We have heard the evidence, the testimonies, and the truth. Now we must determine how this community will respond." She opened the floor for resolution proposals, and the coalition leaders stood as one. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the civil rights attorney, speaking clearly. "We demand immediate resignations, restitution to the families and businesses harmed, mandatory civil rights training for all public employees, creation of an independent oversight board, and community investment in minority-owned enterprises." The list was long, but it was just, and the crowd roared approval. Reynolds' lawyer tried to object, but the noise drowned him out. The mediator quieted the hall and turned to Reynolds himself. "You may speak if you choose." The officer stood slowly, hands shaking, his voice weak. I may have used poor judgment, but one mistake doesn't define a man." His words were met with jeers, shouts of, "Too late! You're finished." Henry himself rose, his voice carrying over the noise. "The measure of a man is not in his mistakes, but in how he faces the truth when it comes to light. Silence fell. Every eye fixed on the 72-year-old veteran who had endured humiliation, yet stood with dignity. Henry turned his gaze directly on Reynolds. "You struck me because you thought I was powerless. You silenced others because you thought no one was watching. But tonight the whole nation is watching, and they see you for what you are." Reynolds sat back down, his lawyer pulling at his sleeve, his face drained, and the mediator called the vote. The community had its say. 418 voted for full accountability measures, only 57 opposed. The rest abstained. The decision was decisive. The hall erupted in cheers. Tears streamed down faces. Veterans saluted Henry. Young students raised their phones to capture history. And as the crowd poured out into the night chanting, "Justice now," the world knew that Asheville had changed forever. The slap meant to humiliate an old man had instead ignited a reckoning. And though the road ahead would be long, the tide of silence had turned. The people had spoken, and power had shifted back where it belonged, in the hands of justice. 3 months later, Asheville no longer looked like the same town that had gasped in silence when Officer Mark Reynolds slapped an old man inside Jackson's diner. The streets were busier. The walls of downtown carried murals of unity, and a sense of accountability hovered over the community like a new atmosphere. Reynolds himself was gone, no longer an officer, no longer protected by a badge. Instead, he faced federal charges for civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. His career destroyed, his reputation in tatters, his face once smug and arrogant now plastered across headlines as a warning of what happens when abuse of power is caught in the light. His trial date was set, and legal experts predicted prison time. Sheriff Tom Harlan resigned under pressure, later indicted for deliberately burying complaints and tampering with records. Mayor Martha Johnson, once the face of Asheville's political leadership, stepped down in disgrace after her own emails were revealed. She too faced charges for conspiracy and fraud. The old power structure had crumbled completely, and in its place rose something new, the community itself, led not by politicians, but by ordinary citizens who had chosen courage over silence. Linda Perez, the waitress who once feared losing her job for speaking out, was now the mayor of Asheville, elected in a landslide after vowing to restore integrity and equality. Her victory speech delivered from the steps of City Hall with tears in her eyes. "This is not about me. It's about us. About every person who was told they didn't belong and every person who finally stood up and said enough." The crowd of thousands roared their approval. Ethan Brooks, the young journalism student whose footage had exposed the truth to millions, received a National Journalism Award, a full scholarship, and offers from networks across the country, but he chose to stay close to Asheville for now, working on a documentary titled "Silence Ends Now" that chronicled not just the slap, but the entire movement that followed. His voice narrating softly. "I came to capture small-town life, but what I found was small-town courage." Fire Chief Daniel Harper, who had once admitted his own failures, was appointed interim sheriff after Harlan's resignation, his first order of business creating an independent oversight board made up of clergy, veterans, and community activists, giving power back to the people. Federal monitors were assigned to the Asheville Police Department for 5 years, ensuring reforms were more than just promises. A $500,000 restitution fund was created for families and businesses who had suffered discrimination, and local banks were forced to undergo audits, new diversity and lending compliance policies mandated by federal law. Across the nation, the ripple effect grew larger. 49 towns in 16 states launched similar investigations. New legislation drafted in Congress bore the name the Washington Act, aimed at increasing accountability for law enforcement and protecting vulnerable communities from systematic exclusion. Henry Washington, the man at the center of it all, returned to his quiet routines. But life was never quite the same. Every Tuesday, he still walked into Jackson's diner. But now the booth he sat in was forever reserved in his honor. A brass plaque mounted above it reading, "Dignity is not silent." Strangers stopped to shake his hand. Children asked to take pictures with him. Veterans saluted him, and though he accepted it with humility, he often said softly, "I was just having coffee." Yet he understood the truth, that sometimes history begins in the quietest of places. At a table with a cup of black coffee and wheat toast, Maria Santos, who had once feared retaliation for recording the incident, now co-led the Unity Coalition, organizing town events, voter education drives, and diversity training workshops. Her Instagram page, Truth from the Front Lines, grew to over 250,000 followers. Each live stream focused not on outrage, but on healing. Her message simple: we cannot heal what we do not face. National figures visited Asheville, senators, governors. Even the president invited Henry to the White House, awarding him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the audience rising to their feet as he stood, frail but proud, flag pin shining as always, his acceptance speech short but unforgettable. "I wore this flag in war and I wore it in peace. I never imagined I would need to wear it to prove I belong in my own hometown. But here we are. And if my pain brought change, then it was worth it." His words replayed across television, quoted in newspapers, posted endlessly online, resonating deeply with Americans over 50 who remembered their own fights for dignity in decades past. Veterans groups rallied under his name, launching the Washington Initiative, a national program that connected retired service members with civil rights advocacy. By its third month, it had raised $2 million and trained hundreds of volunteers. Asheville itself became a model city, attracting investment not because of property values or exclusion, but because of transparency and inclusion. Businesses flourished. Minority-owned shops reopened downtown. Tourists came not to gawk at scandal, but to celebrate resilience. A new annual event was born, the Asheville Festival of Unity. Its first guest speaker none other than Henry himself, standing beneath a banner that read, "Justice is a choice," and telling the crowd of thousands, "I am not here to relive the past. I am here to remind you of the future we build together." Mark Reynolds, sitting in a jail cell awaiting trial, watched news clips of that festival on a small television. His head bowed, his expensive watch long pawned to pay legal fees, his name cursed in history, his downfall complete, his arrogance replaced by silence, and in that silence the irony lingered, because silence was what had once protected him, and now silence was all he had left. But Henry Washington had something far greater. He had dignity, he had justice, he had a legacy, and as the story closed, America understood the final truth, that sometimes the mightiest battles are not fought with weapons or armies, but with courage, cameras, voices, and the refusal of an old man in a cardigan to bow his head. And for millions who heard his story, they would never forget that dignity is not something you are given. It is something you defend. And sometimes one slap meant to silence can awaken a nation to speak louder than ever before. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If it touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and give it a like. It helps us share more stories that matter.